Hello, everybody. Before we jump into the presentation, there are going to be a few questions that appear on your screen. So please take a minute to answer these, and we will be with you guys shortly. Thanks. Hello again, everybody. My name is Sue Brzee, and I handle the marketing here at 2W Technologies and will be your moderator today. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on Epicor production scheduling. If at any time during today's presentation you have questions, please send them to the question box on your screen. There will be an interactive Q&A at the end, and we will try to get to all of your questions then. For those of you who might not be familiar with 2W Technologies, we're a full-service Microsoft and Epicor certified partner, as well as a Tier 1 cloud service provider. We specialize in manufacturing solutions, and we have clients from various other industries as well. For more information on any of our products and services, you can visit us at 2wtech.com. The presenters for today are going to be Mark Jameson, who is the CEO and President, and Sam Plummer, who's our Senior Epicor Consultant here at 2W Tech. I will now turn it over to Mark to start the presentation.
Hey, thanks, Sue. Hi, everyone. Today we're lucky enough to have Sam Plummer join us. As Sue said, he's one of our senior Epicor consultants. Sam has 20 years of experience in manufacturing information technology and ERP. And for the last 10 years, he's been an Epicor ERP expert working with our manufacturing clients around the country. So Sam, scheduling, critical part of the manufacturing process, yet it's probably the most underutilized feature of Epicor that we see in our clients.
Yes, Mark, it is. And quite often, this is the area where even customers who have been using their ERP system, whether it's Vista or Vantage or Epicor 9 or Epicor 10, whatever it is for and maybe even years, they still feel like they could do a better job in this area. And it really represents a great opportunity for improvement for a lot of our customers.
Well, you put together a lot of really good information here, so I'm just going to step aside and let you have at it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mark. Good day, everyone. I'm glad you took some time out of your busy schedules to join us here, and I just want to share what I think is the most generally pertinent information to everyone. And again, we had some questions as we were putting this together. What versions does this pertain to? And where do I need to be in my implementation process? And I really said, well, Epicor hasn't fundamentally changed production scheduling going clear back to version 8, to the Vista and Vantage 8 and 803 products, through Epicor 9, and now to the various iterations of Epicor 10. The building blocks and the fundamentals in a lot of ways are still very much the same. Now, the software and the features and the bells and whistles, and of course the bug fixes have all evolved over that time. But the bottom line is, I think what we're going to talk about today can benefit anyone and everyone who uses an Epicor ERP product. Again, a little bit about why. What are the benefits and the reasons why we might choose to invest, our time and our money in improving our ability to use Epicor production scheduling? Well, first of all, and over on the right-hand side of this slide, and you may not be able to read it, and it's not really important that you do, but I just want to point out this is a document that was taken from the Epicor Knowledge Camp manual. Now, any of you that have gone through an Epicor ERP implementation are probably familiar with Knowledge Camp. And one of the things I do as an implementation consultant is I'm a teacher, an instructor, consultant, leader, whatever you want to call it, who helps my customers go through the Knowledge Camp process and begin to understand how the Epicor ERP works. I also tell my customers when I'm presenting that, because that Knowledge Camp manual is a, 50 or 100-page document, but I say this page right here out of the Knowledge Camp manual should be your cheat sheet for the Epicor ERP. And it basically goes through from the top down toward the bottom, the various cycles in the manufacturing process. So up here at the top, we have things like quote entry and sales order entry. And clear down here at the bottom in the cash cycle is where we're doing accounts payable and accounts receivable and financial statement preparation and everything in between. But the bottom line is, and why I think this is pertinent to the question of why production scheduling, is right here. The first thing that happens after we get the order from our customer is the planning cycle. And step one of the planning cycle is to create a job and to get it scheduled based on availability of manufacturing resources. And so I always say that accurate planning and scheduling is really step one of executing our manufacturing processes and eventually getting through to that cash cycle, which is, kind of the finish line of manufacturing. Now, that being said, as I mentioned before, these fundamentals haven't changed since Vista and Vantage version 8. So regardless of what version of the software you're running, the fundamentals are the same, and the fundamental importance of being good at this process is going to make your manufacturing business run better. A little bit, and especially if you need to talk to senior executives within your company about what are the benefits of getting better at production scheduling. Well, lean is certainly one. Getting materials to the right place at the right time in our manufacturing process is lean. It's going to enable us to also be more agile, to react to changes more quickly. And so those are certainly, good executive level benefits that we can tie to being better at this process. Another area down there on my third bullet, customer satisfaction. Customers really find a high degree of satisfaction when, as a supplier, we can accurately predict when we are going to complete the production of a product that we are manufacturing and when in turn we can ship that product to them. And of course, everybody probably wants something tomorrow, but if we can't do that, what we do need to be able to do is anticipate and predict with a high level of accuracy when we can deliver that product to the customer, and then be able to execute on that plan. And again, production scheduling can be very key to being able to promise and deliver on time, and by doing that, increase the satisfaction of our customers. Also, in addition to all of that, of course, this improves cash flow. When we are buying materials as late as we possibly can in the production process, and therefore tying up less cash in inventory and in WIP, and when we are able to effectively and efficiently apply both labor and production machines and resource time in a planned manner, we're able to truly optimize our cash flows. And of course, by doing that, we're able to drive more bottom line profits. So I think those are certainly some of the benefits. And as we, need to talk about how we might justify making additional efforts in this area, those are some areas we can focus on. Another thing I've observed with many of my manufacturing customers is I believe that there is always room to improve in this discipline. So even if we're doing things well today, there's probably ways that we can improve. We can become more efficient. We can become more lean. We can become more agile. And some of the keys to doing those things will be in finding ways to improve our production planning, production scheduling, and related processes within the ERP. One more thing that I want to acknowledge before we go forward is Epicor production scheduling, and really production scheduling in general, regardless of the technology that you use to accomplish it, is complex and confusing. And it can be very easy to lose your way and become frustrated, whether you're new, undergoing a new Epicor ERP implementation, or perhaps you're already implemented but are going back and changing manufacturing processes, or you're simply trying to improve your use of the tool that you already have. And I want to acknowledge that up front, because this is a daunting process, and one that I'm hoping in the next 20 minutes or so, I can provide you some useful information to help you get started on these things. All right. So how do we begin the process of implementing? Well, this slide right here could just as easily be called Consulting 101. Regardless of what the charter of our project or our objective is, these are the steps that we're going to do. We're going to assess our current state. And as part of that assessment, we're going to be paying particular attention to identifying what we'll call pain points. In other words, where are those things that we hurt ourselves? It might be late shipments to customers. It might be excessive overtime. It might be excessive inventory, excessive WIP. All of those pain points, if they exist in our organizations, indicate that we may be able to address those by improving our production planning and scheduling processes. Once we've identified those pain points, the next step is, of course, to prioritize them. What is more important? Is it more important for us to reduce our WIP or to improve our on-time deliveries to our customers? And those can be tough decisions because obviously, at least in some cases, improving one metric is going to negatively impact another. But if we've established our priorities up front, in other words, which one is more important, then we have a guiding principle to move forward with. So then once we've assessed and analyzed and prioritized, the last step, of course, here, number 4, is to plan. Now, you notice I have 2 bullets under planning. I have the whole enchilada and bite at a time. Well, I'm a very strong advocate of the bite at a time approach to planning change within an organization. In other words, and it can be very daunting, whatever the change is, but certainly in the area of production scheduling, to take a look and try to fix all the problems at once and make many, many changes with the idea that, we're going to do this 6 months or 12 months or whatever duration of project, and we're going to, make all these changes, and then suddenly at the end all of our problems are going to be better, and then we're never going to have to change anything else. That approach tends not to work for a whole variety of reasons that I'm not going to go into. But what I believe is the best bang for the buck and the most likely to succeed is small incremental changes made frequently. In other words, a bite at a time approach. So when we look at what we want to do and considering our pain points and priorities, let's try to just positively improve 1 or 2 of those with some modest changes. And then once we've achieved success in that, we'll come back to the list again and we'll make some more improvements. And I think for a whole variety of reasons, that approach is much more likely to succeed, and it's also much more likely to not be bogged down by external risks, whether those risks be, personnel changes, changes in your marketplace, or other external factors to your business. All right, so once we have taken those 4 steps of assessing and then planning our approach, what are the fundamentals that we are going to need to focus on as an organization to move forward? Well, the first fundamental of scheduling is your methods or methods of manufacture. And in particular, of course, every method of manufacture, in Epicor terms, is made up of a bill of operations, in many cases also referred to as a routing. In other words, what are the steps that we do when we manufacture a particular product? And related to that bill of operations is the bill of materials. What are the materials that we either need to purchase or make ahead of time in order to accomplish those manufacturing operations on the bill of operations? We need our methods to be accurate. In other words, one of the preparatory steps that we need to take as we look to implement better and more effective production planning and scheduling is first to improve the accuracy of our bills of operations. And that primarily comes through the discipline of estimate to actual comparison, and doing that in a timely fashion, as close to the actual manufacturing activity as possible. In other words, we're going to have a lot more success identifying errors in our bills of operations when we talk to the frontline supervisors and the manufacturing employees immediately during or after the time that they work on a particular job or a particular operation, rather than waiting until weeks or months later when all the details have been forgotten. Another important thing that there is to focus on to make your methods more reflective of the actual flow of work through your plant. In many cases, I find that routings and bills of materials were really designed only to support the cost accounting structure. In other words, those operations may have been consolidated together in order to simplify reporting. And from a cost accounting point of view, they might work very well. But what we need to be aware of is we may need to change those structures to support better and more accurate production planning and scheduling. And again, my rule of thumb is that the bill of operations should correspond to the actual process. In other words, we should be able to both electronically within the job and physically within the flow of work within the plant, they should look and feel in a similar way. And of course, the next step here is detail. Generally, and in particular, when I talk about detail, I'm talking about sub-assemblies. And I know that can be a dirty word in many businesses because no one wants to deal with the complexity of sub-assemblies. But it is really important that if we're going to be able to accurately track production activity against a routing, that we consider the use of sub-assemblies and don't rule them out and automatically flatten all our bills of materials out of hand. A flat bill of materials can be a good intermediate step, but the promised land lies in a fully indented bill of materials. Also, another important aspect in many cases, and the Epicor ERP from back to version 8 and even really prior to that, materials are not required to be related to specific operations on the routing. However, I think in order to truly achieve the lean and agile benefits of accurate production planning and scheduling, that all materials should be related to the operation at which they are consumed. And that is going to help us achieve some of the downstream benefits, especially as it applies to reductions in WIP and reductions in inventory, and kind of that whole lean and agile concepts of right material at the right place at the right time. What are a few of the other preparatory steps in addition to really fine-tuning our methods that we can take on? Well, a focus on more real-time gathering and reporting of production data. In other words, use of MES. Because the Epicor system is going to function best for you and deliver the greatest results when we get timely and accurate labor and production information. And the best way to do that is through using the MES as opposed to employee timesheets. I also, last on this slide, want to acknowledge that these fundamentals really extend across the three broad categories of manufacturers that I see using the Epicor ERP. The first of those being the true engineer to order type manufacturers versus job shops versus repetitive manufacturers. But these same fundamentals, I would argue, apply regardless of which of these three categories that your business falls into. And you may fall into all three of them in a blended model. But I just want to acknowledge that regardless of what you do, I think these fundamentals apply to you. Okay, so, and this slide will be just a little bit of recap for most of you that have spent much time in Epicor production scheduling, but these are some of the areas that you are going to be spending time in as you roll up your sleeves and get down to the business of reviewing production scheduling. First of all, one of the first building blocks is, of course, parts and revisions. And the parts and the revisions of those parts are, of course, where our methods are stored, our bills of operations and bills of materials. Bills of operation, in turn, are made up of the building blocks of individual operation codes. Those operation codes, of course, are dependent upon one or more resource groups or resources. And then, truly, at the lowest level of production scheduling are production calendars. And production calendars basically define the working and non-working hours available to each resource within a resource group. So these, again, are the areas that I believe that you'll be focusing on, and these are some of the screens and the or business objects within Epicor that you'll be interacting with as you go back and start retooling, revamping, and fine-tuning your routings primarily to better serve the goal of improved production scheduling. So, once you're into the trenches here and you've gotten down to this point where we're actually going to try and implement some change, what are some recommendations that I have for you regarding your approach? Well, the first of those, again, I'm a firm believer in prototyping. Make a small, develop a model. Hopefully all of you have a sandbox environment where you can play, whether that's your test database or, some other sandbox environment. You need to have a recent copy of your production database in an isolated environment where it's okay to play. And then begin prototyping. Identify those changes you want to make. Only make a few. Make only one or two changes. And then run through a test and evaluate whether those changes improved or worsened the overall process. If you're moving towards your goal, then you are going to identify that at this phase, and then you can move back and identify what is the next change you want to make. What I strongly suggest avoiding is trying to change more than just a few parameters at one time. And literally, if you're really struggling, you probably need to change only one thing in each iteration of a prototype. In other words, focus on small changes made incrementally. So change something, prototype and test, evaluate results, and then repeat. Now, to this end, I think one of the benefits of this approach is within your organization eventually, but definitely within your implementation team, you're going to be establishing the principle of a culture of change. In other words, just because we're doing something this way today doesn't mean we need to do it that way tomorrow or the next day or the week or year or decade after that. Because I do see a lot of customers who become stuck in one way of doing things. And in fact, they've been doing things in the exact same way for so long that nobody even knows why they're doing them that way. And so I just want to encourage you to start sowing that seed where we're going to turn our company into one that embraces change and is able to, make positive change a constant thing. Okay, so this slide right here kind of says it all. These are the cheat codes. In other words, the quick start guide for getting started with scheduling in the Epicor ERP. And again, these are based on my experiences in implementing or assisting dozens of companies in trying to more fully utilize Epicor ERP scheduling. First of all, there's many, many choices about really thousands of scheduling parameters, but I want to focus on just a few. First of all, I highly recommend that you start with backward scheduling because it's the most natural for all of us. If we were going to travel out of town to attend a wedding and the wedding starts at 1 p.m., in order to figure out when we need to leave the house and when we need to get dressed and all those other things, we're going to naturally backward schedule. And so I think, and I would argue that that's the most understandable for us. And of course, it's also most understandable if we ask the Epicor scheduling engine to use that same methodology. Another piece of advice is to start with infinite capacity scheduling. And by definition, when you infinite capacity schedule more than one job that is due on or about the same time and is potentially using the same resources, you are going to create overloads. But it's easier to understand the overloads and the results of infinite capacity scheduling initially than it is to understand finite capacity scheduling. Now, it's not to say that finite capacity scheduling is bad, but it is in a kind of a crawl, walk, run type of approach. I think it's something you first want to understand infinite capacity scheduling before you try and deal with finite. Another important concept is simplicity. Again, when we start looking at not so much the operation master file, but when we look at resources and resource groups and production calendars, we can start to introduce a lot of complexity because there's a lot of parameters there that sound tempting. Things like concurrent capacity and move and queue times and send ahead offsets and really hundreds of other parameters, all of which affect each other. My advice, keep your hands off the buttons. Take the default values right out of the box and only change one or maybe two things when you really understand what their impacts are. I also recommend that to start, you limit yourself to one scheduling requirement per operation. The standard Epicor software allows 2 scheduling requirements per operation, but I suggest you focus on one. As you move forward, you can add a second one. And if you find that you need additional scheduling requirements, perhaps beyond a machine and an employee, or a machine and a tool, or whatever that case may be, Epicor offers the advanced planning and scheduling module that allows unlimited scheduling requirements, but I really think that's way too complex to start with out of the box. So one scheduling requirement per operation. What are the things you should focus on initially as you start to try to understand Epicor production scheduling? Focus on the start and end dates that the scheduling engine assigns to jobs and the start and end dates that the scheduling engine assigns individual operations within a job. I also see a lot of customers get really caught up in the day and the hour and the minute even of when a specific operation on a specific job is scheduled to start and end. But I think you're wasting your time there initially. I would make the argument that in most cases, if you can get your jobs scheduled to start and end in the right day, you're doing really, really well. And if you can get most or all of your jobs to start and end in the right week, you're probably doing good enough. And that, by the way, feeds into my next bullet point, which I'll talk about in a moment. But another important area of focus for you is your production reporting. In other words, really, really drill down into those MEF screens and understand and coach your employees and develop policies and procedures about how an employee is to report labor. What is a quantity? What is setup versus production, etc. These are all things that you need to define within the context of your organization and your methods of manufacturing. Next, I think scheduling, at least initially, tends to work best when we approach it as a weekly cycle. In other words, we are determining what we are going to try to get done in a given production week, and then tracking our progress against that plan as the week progresses. And then towards the end of the week, we are in the process of firming up the production plan for the following week. So I coach you not to get caught up on trying to do this in a daily cycle, although some businesses will be driven to that. But try first to approach your production scheduling on a weekly cycle. And that includes some specific processes, including the calculate global scheduling order process and the global reschedule. And understanding more about how these processes work is something that we can talk about a little bit more if you want to during the Q&A session. But I just want you to understand, at least conceptually, that I think you should approach this as a weekly process. Okay, so a little bit about the resources that are available to you. And in particular, these are things that in many cases you already have. The first and really most important and valuable resource you have is your employees, whether that's production personnel on the plant floor, whether that's your lead hands and supervisors and foremen, and on up to your office personnel, production planners, production managers. The knowledge of what's right and what's wrong in your business resides within them. So make sure that you are open to what they're saying and listening and taking every opportunity to gather that feedback and involve them in the decision-making process of improving your business. The next is Epicor documentation. And generally, the Epicor provided documentation falls into three categories. And all of these are available to you. First of all, the technical reference guides. There is an Epicor technical reference guide. In most cases, it's available right through the embedded help within the Epicor ERP. I'm thinking the scheduling technical reference guide for the latest version of Epicor is probably on the order of 500 or 600 pages of documentation. It is available to you. You've paid for it. Use it. Also available from Epicor. Now, these are generally available for download from EpicWeb, our implementation guides. The implementation guides are documents with a lot of good information in them provided by Epicor. Now, there is a single Epicor ERP implementation guide. I believe Epicor began distributing these with ERP 10, but they really, a lot of what they contain pertains to older versions of the software as well. But the implementation guide really discusses those things you find in the setup folder. In particular, as it relates to production scheduling, setting up parts revisions using the engineering workbench, also setting up operations, resources, resource groups, and production calendars. If you want to know how to do those things and you don't know today, the implementation guide and the next set of documents, the user guides, have chapters within them that tell you how to do that. Now, that being said, both implementation guides and user guides are consolidated documents that are ERP-wide. So technical reference guides are specific to specific areas of the software. For example, there is a scheduling technical reference guide. Implementation and user guides are all modules, all areas of the system, from CRM through quoting and sales through accounting, are all in the same implementation guide. But across all that documentation, I'm going to say there's probably several thousand pages relevant to scheduling that's available to you that you've already paid for. Another important resource that I don't think is adequately appreciated by many in the Epicor user base is your peers. In many regions of the country, there's active Epicor user groups who meet regularly and provide a lot of good information from other companies who are also using Epicor software about how they are effectively using, for example, Epicor production scheduling. And it's a great opportunity to learn what other companies like yours are doing with Epicor. And of course, along those lines, in addition, at the annual Epicor User Conference, which is coming up here very shortly, you will find there are both Epicor-led sessions and, more importantly, Epicor customer-led sessions where they really detail and demo how particular customers are using this tool to their business advantage. And then lastly, if all else fails, you can call a consultant. And, obviously you're already here and you know how to access 2W technologies. So, you can avail yourself of that help if you're so inclined. All right, well, I believe at this point we have reached the end of my prepared content, and I think I'm going to pass back to Sue, who is going to open it up the forum for some questions and answers.
All right, great. Thanks, Sam. So we're going to move to the Q&A part of this presentation now. As a reminder, if you haven't submitted your questions yet, you can still do so using the question box that's on your screen. A few of you had submitted questions already in regards to some of the resources that Sam just covered in the last slide, so I think he adequately answered all of those. So if not, just drop me a line, one of us an email after this, and we'll get back to you. But I think Sam pretty much covered the training material pretty good. So the first question then for you, Sam, is what is the difference between backward and forward scheduling?
Okay. Well, in a nutshell, and it's something I touched on a little bit, but essentially when we backward schedule, we look at a particular sequence of steps, in this case, our simple routing, and we determine the duration of each operation, and then we figure out when we need to have something done. In other words, generally speaking, an ultimate due date of a job is typically going to be driven by the ship by date of the corresponding sales order line and release. In other words, if we told the customer, I'm going to ship that to you on June 1st, and that would be the date to which we plan. So from a production management point of view, we need to have all of our production management activities completed by that time. And then we just back off, so the last operation needs to be done on June 1st. And then if it takes 2 days, we need to start it 2 days before. And then we keep working backwards to determine when the start date will be. Whereas in the case of forward scheduling, we get to determine the input provided to the scheduling engine in this case is what date do we want to start production. And then instead of working backwards from a need by or ship by date, we instead say if we start production on this day and then work forward, we have an operation that takes 2 days and then another operation that takes 8 hours. We work forward in time and we calculate when the date of completion is. So in a nutshell, that's the difference between forward and backward scheduling.
Okay, and I think the next question kind of fits in with that a little bit. What is the difference between infinite and finite capability scheduling?
Well, a long time ago, somebody said this to me, and it's kind of stuck with me. So when we schedule infinitely, in other words, infinite capacity scheduling, what we are going to do is create overloads. We will be overloading some, or maybe all, but most typically some resources within our manufacturing environment. And so as production managers or schedulers or just human beings, we are going to have to manage overloads when we infinite capacity schedule. Whereas if we finite capacity schedule, in other words, we take into account the work capacity of each of our resources, and we only schedule that amount of work which we believe can get done in a fixed period of time, whether that's an hour or a day or a week. What we will generally be doing in those cases is creating a situation where some jobs, or at least some operations, are late. So in other words, they can't be done in time to meet their ship by date, perhaps. So when we finite capacity schedule, the job of the humans in the system is to manage lateness. So again, just to recap what that thing is, when we infinite capacity schedule, we manage overloads. When we finite capacity schedule, we have to manage lateness. So that's the difference, again, very briefly in a nutshell. And by the way, Epicor production scheduling most often is a blend of those two approaches.
Continuing on with that subject, Sam, can you speak a little bit to double scheduling? I know there was a question about when you use infinite scheduling, sometimes it disregards a job that's already in line for that machine. So can you speak to that topic a little bit?
Right. Well, and what the way I would interpret that, it sounds like what we have there is what I would reference as an overload. In other words, let's just say we have two different parts, both which we need to have completed on Friday, let's say. And both of those parts to manufacture them require 16 hours of lathe time. Let's just say that's the only resource. We're going to turn a piece of bar stock on a lathe. So that's the only operation that we have to do. They're both due on Friday. The lathes only work one shift, so their production calendars only have 8 hours of production available on Friday and 8 hours on Thursday. And we have one lathe. So if we were to create those two jobs for quantity of one each, let's say, and we scheduled them backward, infinite capacity, we would overload our lathe. So in other words, if we looked at the schedule for that lathe, it would be scheduled to be doing 2 16-hour job operations all day Thursday and Friday, the definition of an overload. So again, what would be the job of a human in that environment? The human would need to recognize that overload through a variety of tools. Epicor provides things like the overload informer or the shop load report, whatever we want, and say, oh, guess what? Both my only lathe is overscheduled by 100% on Thursday and Friday. What am I going to do? Well, I better tell them to do one of those 2 jobs beginning on Monday or Tuesday and Wednesday at least. And that way I've resolved the overload, external to the system. Alternatively, we could look at using finite capacity scheduling for that. But again, those are, some of the scenarios that we need to play with.
Okay. Next question. How does the system handle jobs where the material is not connected to a specific operation? Does it just disregard the material requirement?
No, and I believe this is true clear back to version 8, to the current version today. If you do not associate a material with a specific operation on the job, from a time phase point of view, in other words, if you look at time phase inquiry and figure out when is that material needed, it is at the start of the first operation on that job. Now, if we have multiple assemblies, it's at the first operation at that assembly level. But, in a simple single level job, if we have only assembly 0 and it has 5 operations on it, and let's just say, we have a bunch of machining and manufacturing operations, and then the last operation is a mechanical assembly. And let's, for instance, just say that the mechanical assembly, the last operation we're going to do, requires a really expensive control component. What Epicor is going to assume, if we don't associate that component with that mechanical assembly, the last operation sequence, Epicor is going to assume we need it at the start of the first operation. In other words, probably, in a simple machine shop environment when we start soft cutting or plasma cutting our raw material.
Okay. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the importance of production calendars?
Yes. Production calendars can be specified at many levels. And again, the importance of a production calendar is, and if you've ever looked at the production calendar entry screen, it's basically a grid of hours when we look at that, and it basically defines, is this hour of this day, like starting with Sunday at midnight and running until 11:59 on Sunday in the first row, and then the second row is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday to Saturday at the bottom of the screen, a grid of hours. And we use a series of checkboxes to indicate whether in this production calendar is this hour available or not available for production. So again, the production calendar is the basic building block, because a production calendar can be assigned to an individual resource or to a resource group. But it's definitely, at its simplest level, we can define a single production calendar as the default production calendar at the company level. And if that's the only one we want to use, then what that means is every resource is going to look to that calendar to determine how many hours per day it can work. And production calendars are important regardless of whether you are finite or infinite capacity scheduling. The reason for that is it determines the hours that each resource is available. So again, in an infinite capacity scheduling scenario, if we have, again, back to my 16 hours of time turning a part on a lathe, if we really need that much time to do something, and we've set up a production calendar where there's 8 hours per day, when we go to schedule that operation, Epicor is going to assume we need 2 days to get that done. We need the 8 production hours available on the first day, and we need the 8 production hours available on the second day. Whereas, if we had defined our production calendar as being a 24-hour per day, we checked all the boxes, in other words, in production calendar entry. Now what we're telling Epicor when it goes to schedule that 16-hour operation, theoretically, I could start it at midnight and finish it by 4 p.m. So that's what it would do, of course, in an infinite capacity scheduling world. In finite capacity, it would also tell me if one job is already occupying those time slots, then I need to go look for some other ones when the second job comes along. So again, fundamental building block of scheduling is production calendars.
Okay, we have a follow-up question to that. Can you explain the benefit of grouping resources versus keeping resources separate? Example, when my machines are grouped in resources and when I schedule a job, I cannot see what machine it is loading my calendar on.
I believe, and so the best kind of generalized advice that I have is we should always approach scheduling to the resource group level, even if a resource group only contains one resource. And so the Epicor scheduling engine will, especially in a finite capacity scheduling, will automatically load level within a resource group. In other words, back to my simple example in a machine shop with lathes. So let's just say I have 3 lathes and they all run for only one shift. So I'd set up a 8-hour per day production calendar. I would create a resource group for my, medium-sized lathes, and I would put lathe 1, lathe 2, and lathe 3 in that group. And then the Epicor scheduling engine would automatically load level across those 3 resources within the group if I'm finite capacity scheduling.
Okay, we have another. Oh, go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's okay. I tend to talk too much anyway. Hopefully I got to some of the point there.
Well, there was a follow-up question still to calendars. What if certain production employees can only run certain machines? How do you best assign calendars to that resource?
Well, and I think what we're doing is getting into multi-constraint scheduling. In other words, again, back to my lathe example, if instead of just scheduling the machine, I also want to schedule an employee to do that, now we're talking about an operation, the lathe turning operation perhaps, that has 2 scheduling requirements. We need the lathe, we need the machine, and then we also need perhaps a machinist or an operator or whatever we define that as. So, and there's a couple of ways to approach this, and some of that has to do with, is that lathe operator also capable of doing other things? Like, for example, maybe he can also operate a mill. So, and then we really, so again, just starting out in scheduling, I would focus in this case on getting the machine scheduled and then handle the labor component outside of the Epicor scheduling initially. Now, as we go forward, and I have had, but this, and I just want to be upfront, this represents a significant level of complexity. In the Epicor Advanced Planning and Scheduling module, we have the ability to define something called capabilities. And capability is essentially an attribute that we can add to one or more resources across resource groups. So, for example, I could have two resource groups, and let's just, for the sake of argument, say I have mill operators and I have lathe operators. But I might have some mill operators who can also operate a lathe and some lathe operators who can also operate a mill. And I could use capabilities to reflect that. And then when I'm building my part method, I would schedule, instead of just scheduling to the resource group lathe operator or mill operator, I would have a scheduling requirement for the capability of saying, I need any resource that's capable of running a mill. And so it would look across, in this case, two resource groups and find an available resource when it was needed.
Okay.
Again, definitely an advanced topic.
Okay. Looks like we just have one last question. Is there a way to expedite a job linked to a sales order?
Probably the easiest way that I would suggest approaching an expedite. And again, a lot of this comes down to how frequently do we schedule, and are we primarily finite or infinite capacity scheduling. But let's, for the sake of argument, just say what would be the easiest way to do what's being suggested. What I would do is get the job engineered. In other words, get our routing and material accurate, engineer the job, and then from within job entry, I would forward infinite capacity schedule it. And so I say, well, I'm going to start doing this tomorrow morning, and it might require me to do, some extra steps. In other words, evaluate availability of materials or whatever. But from a scheduling only point of view, I want to get that job on the schedule to start tomorrow morning. I would forward infinite capacity schedule it from within job entry. And chances are I'm going to create some overloads, because presumably if my shop is fairly busy, I would expect that some or all of the resources are already scheduled to do other work. Then I would take one additional step from job entry. I would schedule lock that job. In other words, in job entry, under the scheduling, there's a locked checkbox there. I would hit that and save that. What that means is no automated rescheduling process can move that job on the schedule. In other words, I've decided to place this job starting tomorrow morning on the schedule, and I've probably created some overloads. So at that point, and let's just for the sake of argument also assume that we have set up the global reschedule process to run overnight. So maybe we run two shifts, and when second shift goes home at 11 o'clock at midnight, we kick off a global schedule process automatically. What the global scheduling process is going to do is it's going to take all the jobs competing with that job that we just forward infinite capacity scheduled and locked and move them back in time. So theoretically, all those other jobs could become late, but the one we just expedited will now be on time. And the global reschedule will push those other jobs back in time.
Okay, I think that's all the questions. Sam, thank you so much for hanging in there for all of those. And for all of you that are still with us, thank you. I know we ran over, but we have some really good questions we wanted to get to. If we can get you any follow-up information, or if you had questions that you didn't submit, Mark and Sam contact information is up on the screen, or you can reply to one of your reminder emails with my information, and we will do the best we can to get you answers. Be on the lookout for details for our next webinar. Thank you, everybody, again for joining us, and I hope everybody has a good day.